They say a woman is only worth what she carries. When she stepped off that wagon in the spring of '81, she carried a carpetbag with a broken clasp, a wedding photograph of a man already 3 weeks in the ground, and a cough she tried to hide behind her glove. Nothing else. No money. No people. No promise except a marriage to a dead man she'd never met. I watched the whole town of Ashfork decide she'd be gone by winter. I'm here to tell you they were wrong. And I'm here to tell you it cost her more than any of us ever knew, because I'm the one who found out what she buried under that eastern fence line, and I've kept it to myself for 40 years. But you should hear it now. Before I'm gone too, and there's nobody left who remembers what she really built out there, or what it took out of her to build it. Sit close, this one stays with you. My name is Elias Crane, and in the spring of 1881 I was 31 years old and about as useless as a man could be while still drawing breath. I'd lost my own place 2 years before, bad debt, worse whiskey, a mortgage I signed drunk and couldn't read sober. So I hired out. Fence work, cattle work, whatever a rancher would pay $1 and a meal for. That's how I came to be at the Ashfork Depot the morning she arrived, waiting on a shipment of wire for old man Deverell, keeping my hat low and my eyes down the way a failed man learns to. The train came in loud and left louder, and when the smoke cleared she was standing on the platform alone. I remember she didn't look around for anybody. That was the first thing. Every stranger who steps off a train looks around for a face, a sign, a wagon sent to fetch them. She just set her bag down, straightened her back, and looked at the town like she was taking its measure and finding it wanting. She was thin in a way that wasn't fashion. Her dress had been good once, dark gray, mended careful at the cuffs so you'd only notice if you were the kind of man who noticed mending, which I was, because I'd been doing my own for 2 years. Her hair was pinned tight. Her face was the kind you'd call handsome before you'd call it pretty, and there was a stillness in it that most folks mistook for coldness. I know better now. It wasn't cold. It was a person holding herself together with both hands and refusing to let anybody see the seams. The station master asked her name. Margaret Ryerson, she said, and then when he squinted, widow of Thomas Ryerson, I've come for his land. Well, that put a stir through the 3 or 4 of us standing near. Thomas Ryerson had 160 acres northeast of town, a homestead claim, half proved up, the other half wild scrub and a creek that ran dry 2 months out of the year. He'd sent east for a bride the way lonely men did back then, through an advertisement and a Chicago matchmaking outfit that took your money and sent you a stranger. He'd been thrown from a horse and killed before the stranger ever arrived. Everybody in Ashfork knew it, and everybody assumed the woman would take one look, sell the claim for whatever a dead man's dirt was worth, and go home. The station master told her, gentle as he could, that Thomas was dead. I know, she said. I got the letter in Ohio. I came anyway. Ma'am, the land ain't proved. You got no claim to it, being he never, being you two never actually. We were married by proxy, she said. Signed and witnessed. I have the paper. She touched her carpetbag. I am his widow in the eyes of the law and the territory. The claim passes to me. I've already written to the land office in Prescott. Silence. I want you to understand something about that time and that place. A woman alone did not do this. A woman alone found a man to marry, or a family to take her in, or a train back to wherever she'd come from. A woman alone did not announce that she intended to prove up a homestead by herself, because everyone knew it couldn't be done. Homesteading broke men. It broke married couples with sons. The graveyard behind the Ashfork church was full of people who'd come out with more than Margaret Ryerson had, and lasted less time. She picked up her bag. Which way is northeast? She asked. Nobody answered for a second. Then I heard my own voice surprising me. I'll take you, I said. Got a wagon. She looked at me, really looked the way she'd looked at the town. I felt her measuring me and I braced for the same verdict. Are you a drinking man, mister? Crane, Elias Crane, I swallowed. I was trying not to be. Something in her face shifted, not softness, recognition maybe. Then you may take me, she said. I can pay you 50 cents. It's all I have to spare and I'll need the rest for seed. I told her she could keep her 50 cents. She told me she didn't accept charity. We settled on the 50 cents and I have that coin still in a drawer, and I've never once been able to spend it. The Ryerson claim, when we reached it near dusk, would have made a strong man weep. There was a soddy, a house made of cut earth, the poorest kind of shelter there was, half caved in on the north wall where the winter had gotten into it. There was a well that Thomas had started and never finished, just a hole with a pile of rock beside it. There was the creek, low and brown. There were 160 acres of grass and sage and rock going gold, and then gray in the failing light. And there was wind, the everlasting wind of that country, coming down off the high ground with nothing to stop it but a widow in a mended dress. I pulled the wagon up and waited for her to break. She climbed down. She walked to the soddy, looked in through the collapsed doorway, and stood there a long moment with her back to me. I saw her shoulders rise once, one breath, drawn deep and held. Then she turned around. I'll need the caved wall shored before dark, she said. Is that something you know how to do, Mr. Crane, or only something you'll watch me do? I got down off the wagon. I want to be honest with you, because this whole story is me trying to be honest about a thing I understood too late. I did not stay that first night out of kindness. I stayed because I could not, for the life of me, drive away and leave her there, and that's a different thing than kindness. Kindness gives. What I felt was more like I'd caught a splinter of her stubbornness under my own skin, and it wouldn't let me go. We shored the wall. She worked beside me, and she did not work like a lady playing at labor. She worked like a person who had done hard things before and expected to do more. Her hands bled, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept working. When it got too dark to see, we sat against the mended wall, and she gave me a piece of hard bread from her bag and took a smaller piece for herself. And I noticed she gave me the larger without seeming to. The way a person does when giving away food is second nature. You didn't have to come out here. I said, there's men in town would have married you, given you a roof by summer. I know. So why? Because Thomas wrote me letters, she said. The wind moved through the sage. For 4 months before I came out, the company arranged one to break the ice, and then he wrote on his own every week. He wasn't clever with words. He spelled beautiful 3 different ways and none of them right. A small sound that might have been a laugh, worn down to almost nothing. He wrote about this land like it was already ours, like I was already standing on it. He'd say, when you see the creek in the morning, Margaret, the light comes down it like it's pouring. He'd never met me, and he wrote to me like I was a person worth building something for. She was quiet a moment. Nobody had ever done that. I was 34 years old, Mr. Crane, and I had been a governess and a laundress and a nurse to a dying woman who left me nothing but her debts, and no one had ever once looked at me and thought, there is a person worth building something for, except a man I never met, 3 weeks dead, who spelled beautiful wrong. She looked out at the dark land. So I came to see the creek in the morning, and now I've seen it, and I find I'm not willing to give it back. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Some things you just sit beside. She near about died that first year. I'll tell it plain because she'd want it told plain. The cough she'd hidden at the depot got into her lungs that first winter and laid her flat for 3 weeks. I was still there. I'd meant to stay a night, and I'd stayed a season, sleeping in the wagon, then in the shored-up soddy when the cold came. Both of us too practical and too tired for anybody in town to make it into the scandal they wanted it to be. I fed her broth. I kept the fire. There was a night her fever climbed so high she talked to Thomas like he was in the room, told him she'd seen the creek, told him she was sorry she was late, and I sat in the corner and wept like a child because I could not stand between her and the thing that was trying to take her. She lived, of course she lived. You knew that or I wouldn't be telling it. But spring came and she was weak as a foal, and the land didn't care. Land never cares. There was breaking to do and seed to get in and a well to finish, and she got up off her sickbed gray in the face and walked out to the field and picked up the plow handles. Margaret, if I don't break ground this month, I lose the season. If I lose the season, I lose the claim. I did not survive that fever to lose the claim, Elias. She'd started calling me Elias somewhere in the fever weeks. I never did get used to how it sounded from her. I took the plow from her, not to shame her, because I could see her hands shaking on the wood and I could see what it was costing her to hide it. She let me, which surprised us both. And she walked behind and dropped seed, and when I looked back she was steady on her feet by pure force of will, and that was the first time I understood that this woman would not be stopped by anything short of the grave, and maybe not even by that. We got the crop in. It came up thin, but it came up. She proved up her first 10 acres that year, and the land office in Prescott entered it in the book. M. Ryerson, 10 acres improved. She cried when the letter came. Once. Then she folded it careful and put it in her carpetbag with Thomas's photograph and his misspelled letters, and she said, "Now, the well. I have to tell you about the eastern fence line now, because that's the thing I promised you at the start, and because I'm an old man and I've learned you shouldn't make a person wait too long for the hard part of a story." In the 3rd year, Margaret dug a proper well. She'd hired 2 men from town by then. She could afford wages barely, off the wheat and the small herd she'd built by trading eggs and mending and hard work into 1 cow, then 3, then a dozen. The town had stopped waiting for her to fail. They'd moved on to resenting her instead, which is a thing prosperous towns do to a woman who succeeds without asking their permission. But she paid honest wages and word got around, and she got her 2 men, and they dug the well along the eastern fence where the ground stayed damp. They struck water at 40 feet, and they struck something else. I was there. I saw the older man come up the ladder white as the wire we'd strung, and I saw him take Margaret aside and speak low, and I saw her go very still in that way she had. Bones. They'd found bones down there in the damp clay. Human bones, old, and with them a few buttons of a kind the army had used 20 years before, and a tarnished ring, and the rusted remains of a cavalry saber. Now here is where the story turns, and here is where I have to tell you about the Apache, because this land, this 160 acres that Thomas Ryerson claimed off a government that had claimed it off people who'd lived on it 1,000 years, was not empty when we came to it. No land out there was ever empty. We just told ourselves it was. There was an old man who lived up in the rocks northeast of Margaret's claim. Apache, Chiricahua, though I didn't know the word then. The town called him nothing polite. He'd survived the wars and the roundups and the trains east to Florida somehow, slipped through all of it, and lived alone up in the high rocks the way she lived alone in the low ground. And I think that's why, in the end, the 2 of them understood each other when nobody else would. His name, he told me much later, was something I couldn't say right. He let me call him Diasche, which was close enough, and which I've since learned means something about the color red, the red of the rocks at evening. He came down to the well the day after they found the bones. I don't know how he knew. The old ones always knew things. He came down out of the rocks on foot, an old man in a mix of army cast-offs and older things, and the 2 hired men reached for the rifle and Margaret stopped them with 1 word. She walked out to meet him alone. I want you to see this. A widow in a mended dress and an old Apache man who'd outlived his whole world, standing across a fence from each other in the wind, and neither one afraid, because I think they'd both used up all their fear years before on bigger things than each other. A note before we go on. If you've come this far, you know the shape of her by now, Margaret Ryerson, who arrived with a broken carpetbag and a dead man's letters and refused to be moved. In the first part, You saw her survive the fever and break the ground and dig down 40 feet into the past. Now you'll see what came up out of that well, and what it cost her to do right by it, and why, years later, every man in the territory wanted the land she'd built. The hardest part of a person's story is never the surviving. It's what they do once they've survived. Once they have something to lose. Once doing right will cost them the very thing they nearly died to build. Stay with me. We're almost to the part I've carried alone for 40 years. Dishchai knew what the bones were. He told Margaret, through a mix of English and Spanish and his own tongue and gestures, and me translating what little I could. And over the weeks that followed, as an understanding grew between them that I've never seen the like of before or since, the whole of it came out. The bones in the well were a young man of his people, and they had not fallen there by accident. 20 years before there had been a killing on this ground. Not a battle, a killing. A group of settlers, frightened and armed and looking for someone to pay for their fear after a hard winter and some stolen cattle, had caught a young Apache man crossing the low ground. He'd been unarmed. He'd been, Diashche said, coming down to trade. They'd killed him and thrown him down the half-dug beginnings of a well, the same hole Thomas Ryerson would later find and think he'd started himself, and they'd filled it partway with rock and never spoke of it, and gone home to their suppers. The old man had been the young man's uncle. He'd searched for that boy for 20 years. He'd known, roughly, the ground where he'd vanished, but the country is wide, and the men who did it were careful, and he'd never found the place. Until a widow dug a well along her eastern fence, and the ground gave up what it had been hiding. Now, here is the morally heavy thing, and I'm going to lay it before you the way it was laid before Margaret, because she never once let herself off easy, and I won't do it for her now. 2 of the men who'd done that killing were still alive, still in the county. One of them was a man named Harlan Deverell, the same Deverell I'd been hauling wire for the day Margaret stepped off the train. He was the biggest cattleman in that part of the territory now, a church deacon, a man whose word could make or unmake a person in Ashfork, and the bones in Margaret's well could hang him. If she spoke. If she did not speak, if she quietly reburied those bones, said nothing, let Diashche take his nephew home to the rocks in secret, then her life would go on. Her land would go on. The town's slow thaw toward her would continue, and she would grow old, prosperous, and safe. If she spoke, she made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county, over the murder of an Apache in a time and place where no white jury would convict a white man for such a thing, and everyone knew it. She would gain nothing. She would risk everything. She would be a woman alone again, standing against the whole weight of the town, for a dead stranger who could never thank her, whose people the town didn't even count as people. I watched her think about it for 3 days. I'll tell you what I saw because I was closer to it than anyone. I saw her go out to the well in the evenings and stand over it. I saw her sit with Thomas's letters in her lap, the misspelled ones, the ones from a man who looked at a stranger and thought there is a person worth building something for. I saw her, on the 3rd night, walk up into the rocks to Diashche's fire and sit with the old man a long time in the dark, the 2 of them not needing many words. And on the 4th morning she came to me and said, "Elias, hitch the wagon. I'm going to town to swear a statement, and I'd be glad of your company, but I'll understand if you won't come. It's going to cost me, and it'll cost anyone who stands beside me." I asked her why. I asked her, God forgive me, I asked her why she'd throw away everything she'd bled for a thing that happened 20 years ago to a man she never knew, that no court would ever punish. She was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing I've carried longest. Because somebody looked at me once and thought I was worth building something for, and I'll not build it on top of a boy nobody came for. She looked out at the land, gold in the morning. The creek pours light down it in the morning, Elias, just like Thomas said. I won't be able to look at it if I stay quiet. And I did not survive everything. I survived to end up as a woman who can't look at her own creek. I hitched the wagon. I'll not draw out what happened in town. It went about how you'd think. She swore her statement before the territorial marshal. The bones, the buttons, the saber, the old man's testimony, all of it. The marshal was an honest enough man but a practical one, and he told her plain that no jury in the territory would convict Harlan Deverell of killing an Apache, and that she'd made herself an enemy for nothing. He was right about the jury. Deverell was never charged. The county closed its ranks around him the way I told you it would. But Margaret had misjudged one thing, and so had I, and so had Deverell, and it's the piece of this story that's kept me believing in people through 40 hard years. She'd thought she stood alone. She always thought that. It was the deepest thing in her from a life where it had always been true. It wasn't true anymore. Word of what she'd done got out, and it turned out that in 20 years other people had suspected, had heard drunken half-confessions, had lost their own to that same frightened cruelty and never dared speak. A Mexican family who ran sheep to the south. A homesteader's widow 2 claims over. The young Apache man's own people, what few were left and near. And a scattering of plain, decent folk in Ashfork itself who were tired, just tired, of pretending they didn't know what their deacon had done. None of it convicted Deverell, but it broke him slow. The church quietly removed him. His creditors who'd feared him stopped fearing him. Men who'd smiled at him started remembering they had business elsewhere. Within 3 years he'd sold out and gone, and I heard he died back east, small and forgotten, and I've never been able to make myself sorry about it. And Margaret gave Deishcha his nephew's bones, and the 2 of them buried the boy up in the red rocks with the rights of his people. And I was the only other soul there, and I have never in my life been anywhere holier than that hillside at evening with those 2 old people singing a dead boy home. Now here is why every man wanted her land. The years turned, as years do. Margaret's 10 proved acres became 40, became the whole 160, and then she bought the 2 claims beside her from folks who gave up, and it became more. The creek that ran dry 2 months a year, she'd studied it, and dug catch ponds up its length the way no one had thought to, patient over years, so that by the time she was an old woman her land held water when everyone else's burned brown in August. In dry country, water is everything. Water is the whole of it. By the time her hair went white, Margaret Ryerson's land was the best watered, best worked, most valuable spread in that part of the territory. And she'd built it out of nothing, out of a broken carpetbag and a dead man's letters and a refusal to lie down. The men came, of course. They came the way they always come to a woman with land, with proposals dressed up as partnerships, offers dressed up as kindness, kindness dressed up as offers. Cattlemen, widowers, a banker from Prescott, young men and old men and men who'd once watched her step off a train and decided she'd be gone by winter, come back 40 years later hat in hand to court the land they'd bet against. She turned every one of them down. I asked her once, near the end, why she never married again. She'd had chances. She'd been alone a long, long time, and I knew better than anyone how heavy a loan can sit on a person. She was on the porch she'd built, looking down at the creek, and she took a while to answer. I was married once, she said, to a man I never met who looked at me across a distance he couldn't even see and thought I was worth something. Everything I built to be worthy of that. Every other man who's come up that road came to me after the land, after the water, after the work was done and the winning was plain. A pause. Thomas is the only one who wanted me before there was anything to want. I'll keep faith with that. It's not loneliness, Elias, whatever it looks like from the outside. It's the opposite. It's the one thing I've never let anybody take. The light was going down the creek just like he'd written, pouring. She died in the winter of her 79th year, in the house she'd built up from a caved-in soddy, and she left the land, all of it, the whole hard-won kingdom of it, not to any man, and not to any church, and not to the town that had bet against her and then wanted her. She left it to the descendants of the young man in the well, to Deishcha's people. In her will, in her own careful hand, She wrote that the land had never truly been Thomas's or hers to begin with, that it had belonged to a boy who'd been thrown down a hole for the crime of crossing his own country, and that she was only giving back what had been taken, with interest, the interest being 40 years of her life poured into it like light down the creek. The town was scandalized. The men who'd wanted the land were furious. There were lawyers and there were challenges, and it dragged on past my caring about it. But I was her executor, and I fought for it, and it held. I'm an old man now, older than she was when she died, the last one left who was there at the depot the morning she stepped off the train with nothing. People still tell her story around here, though they get it wrong mostly. They tell it as a story about a woman who came with nothing and built an empire, and they leave out the well, and the bones, and the boy, and the choice she made that cost her everything and gained her nothing but the ability to look at her own creek in the morning. They tell it like it's about the land. It was never about the land. I've got her 50-cent piece in my drawer still, the one she paid me that first day that I could never spend. And I've got the last thing she ever said to me, 3 days before the end, when I sat by her bed and she was mostly gone but surfaced once, clear, and looked at me. I won't tell you all of it, some things a person keeps. But she said the light was pouring down the creek, and she said she wasn't late after all.